acoustic agents. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Chen. I would like to start thanking Xavier for the invitation and for the opportunity to be at this symposium. And in the next 10 minutes, I will speak a little bit about living synergic therapies to achieve therapeutic sweet spot with real-world evidence. So I have to start this presentation asking you, why do we need real-world evidence? Or do we need real-world evidence in the world today with the large, well-controlled, randomized clinical trials? What could this information add to us? So these are my potential disclosures. So I start showing to you two figures from Professor Edelman. In this one, he suggests that there may be a difference between the effectiveness of a medication in a randomized clinical trial and in our real world, in our clinical practice. And sometimes this can be a big difference. If you look at this graphic, or this figure, it's showing the efficacy of a GLP-1 analog in the change in HbA1c in randomized clinical trials in real-world study. You see there's a big gap, there's a big difference. And, well, there are a lot of different explanations for this difference, but one of the most important, according to Professor Edelman, is adherence, is compliance, being compliant with the treatment. So this is the first point. If you look at real-world studies or real-world data with SGLT2 inhibitors and sulfonylurea, will we see the same results here? Will we also see this big gap that we see with GLP-1 analogs? To do this comparison, I am showing to you now data on one specific SGLT2 inhibitors, which is dapagliflozin. So we see here data from 5 different randomized clinical trials. I will ask you to look at this one because it shows the efficacy of dapagliflozin when added on to a sulfonylurea for 6 months. So keep this number in mind, that in a randomized clinical trial, the 6 months treatment with dapagliflozin leads to a 0.8 reduction in HbA1c. Can we achieve the same reduction in our clinical practice? Can we achieve the same reduction with real-world evidence? So it's a pleasure to me to present to you for the first time data on the ADD2DA study, which is a retrospective short review with type 2 diabetes mellitus to assess effectiveness of adding SGLT2 inhibitor to glycoside modifying release therapy. So the primary objective of this real-world study was to evaluate the effectiveness of the combination of glycoside-MR-based therapy and SGLT2 inhibitors for patients with type 2 diabetes as measured by HbA1c changes. We had also other endpoints including blood pressure, changes in lipid profile, and different measures in the real-world evidence. This is an international retrospective study involving 5 different countries. It was done using a short review by patients from Brazil, China, Philippines, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. The main inclusion criteria was for patients with type 2 diabetes for at least 2 years prior to the initiation of SGLT2 inhibitor. Patients should be receiving glycoside MR at a minimum dose of 6 milligrams. You see that the average dose was 76. So these patients were selected if they were using glycoside. An SGLT2 inhibitor was initiated, and then patients were followed for up to 3 years. So we could check the effect of this combination in HbA1c and other metabolic parameters. Just for you to know, about 50% of the patients received dapagliflozin and about 50% empagliflozin, was almost half the two different SGLT2 inhibitors. So we had 5 national coordinators. I'd like also to thank some of the investigators that are present here, 25 different sites, 25 treating physicians, and more than 500 patients were eligible for the study. So most of the studies had uncontrolled diabetes, unfortunately. 87% of the patients included in the study had HbA1c higher than 7. So there were a few patients included with HbA1c below 7. 63% of the patients with HbA1c higher than 8, which suggests that our patients all over the world are really poor. So, what were the main results of this real-world trial? After 6 months of therapy with SGLT2 inhibitor, we saw a 0.1% reduction in HbA1c. You remember the data on the randomized clinical trial with dapagliflozin? 0.8% reduction. So in this case, it was possible to achieve a similar reduction in HbA1c in real-world practice that were achieved in the randomized clinical trial. If you look at patients with HbA1c higher than 7.5, we saw a 1.2% reduction. And for those patients with HbA1c higher than 9, 2.2% reduction, which is quite similar to data from, once again, the randomized clinical trials. We had data on some patients for up to 3 years of follow-up. And for these patients who were followed for 3 years, we had a 0.6 reduction in HbA1c. I did not show this data to you, but if you look at studies like the DECLARE-TN study or the EMPA-HEG study, which lasted for 3 to 4 years, you will see that the reduction of HbA1c in these studies are usually 0.4, 0.5% in the long term. So once again, similar results were obtained in this real-world study in comparison to randomized clinical trials. If you look at patients with baseline HbA1c higher than 7.5, we had almost 1% reduction in HbA1c, and for patients with HbA1c higher than 9, 1.8 reduction of HbA1c. Like I said, we also look at other metabolic parameters, including body weight. So, as expected, patients who received the SGLT2 inhibitor had a reduction of 1.7 kilograms. And we look at data on systolic, diastolic, and lipid profile. We saw a significant reduction in systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and significant improvements in triglycerides, total cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol. Quite similar to the results that we saw on different RCTs with both EMPA and dapagliflozin. So we had to think, why did we have results that were quite similar to the RCTs? One of the possible explanations is because our discontinuation rate, or the discontinuation rate of this combination in the clinical practice may be not as high as the one with GLP-1 analogs, for instance. So if you look at here, we saw that only 2.2% of the patients who received the combination discontinued the medication, discontinued both during the study. So less than 10% of the patients discontinued even one of the two medications. So maybe in this real-world scenario, we have a better compliance to this combination, and that compliance, that adherence to this study, to the drugs, leads to these good results that we see both after 6 months and also in the long-term follow-up of up to 3 years. So some key take-home messages. First, we have the long persistence of the combination, almost 2.5 years with low drop-off rates. Maybe this good results are a result of the strong effectiveness of the combination, the synergic and complementary mechanism of action of an SGLT2 inhibitor and the sulfonylurea. The combination therapy helps to better control cardiometabolic risk factors, so you see here the HbA1 change in the patients, in 6 months, the higher reduction for patients poorly controlled. I did not have the time to talk, but very low rates of hypoglycemia, no episodes of severe hypoglycemia, benefits on the systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and weight reduction. So, why do we need this combination? First, to address real-world needs. The striking reality is that a significant number of patients remain with uncontrolled glycemic, and we strong need to tackle clinical inertia to improve these results. There was a clinical significant reduction in glycemia, early, 6 months, and sustained for up to 3 years. The combination was well tolerated with very few hypoglycemic events and no episode of severe hypoglycemia. And finally, only 2% of the patients discontinued both treatment. Probably this would be the explanation for our results. The combination will be welcome in clinical practice because it offers a highly efficient, sustainable solution to tackle critical challenge we are facing in diabetes care today. Thank you very much for your attention.
This is made for tall people. Right. We have 5 minutes to try and answer questions. So just in case you still want to ask questions, the QR code is up there. Let me start with Professor Muhammad. There's a question on recognizing the gap between what you get from randomized controlled trials versus real world. What are your thoughts? You showed us the publication, and how do you think you could try and avoid this?
I showed to you some nice data from Professor Edelman, particularly with GLP-1 agonists. And I strongly believe that everyone here loves GLP-1 analogs. This is really true. I don't know how it works in all of the different countries that we see here, but in Brazil, the average time that a patient uses a GLP-1 analog is about 3 months. Usually they start the medication, but in Brazil they are quite expensive, I believe, like in other countries, and usually patients do not continue to use it for a long time. And when you start a medication or a combination of medications in type 2 diabetes, you should tell the patient that he will have or she will have to use this medication for a long period of time. So we have to choose medications that patient will be able to afford, not only for 3 or 6 months, but for 3 years, for 5 years. So I think there's a big explanation for the GLP-1 analysis in Professor Edelman. He showed the same figure with DPP-4 inhibitors. And even with DPP-4 inhibitors, he showed a smaller gap, a 0.2 difference in HbA1c, suggesting that if you have a medication that is more accessible, that's more easy to keep it for the long time, maybe you decrease this gap. So I think I have to agree with Professor Edelman that adherence, that compliance with the medication would be the most important strategy to keep it for a long time.
Asking, if GLP-1 were free, would you use it instead of sulfonylurea, Professor Rodrigo?
I think if GLP-1, metformin, and SGLT2 inhibitors, they were all free, we have a lot of options. And even with all these options on the market, at least in my country, metformin is free, glycoside is free for a very significant number of patients. Even in countries where these medications are provided by the government, we still have a lot of patients with uncontrolled diabetes. I usually like to present this, that in the last, if you look at one of the figures that Professor Hansen showed to you, in the United States, if you look at the United States, where patients have access to GLP-1, insulin, everything, the number of patients achieving an HbA1c below 7 is decreasing over the years. This was published in JAMA about 3 months ago. So if you're looking at the United States, with all medication available, the number of patients with good glycemic control is decreasing. Why? If they have access, if we have a lot of options, if we have different DPP-4, sulfonylureas, I think that this is not the only problem. This is one of the biggest problems, but we also have to face clinical inertia. We have to be more aggressive in treating our patients and combining therapy early to achieve glycemic control in the long term. I think we could spend more 30 minutes just showing different studies demonstrating that when you combine medication on a single pill, you increase adherence and increase effectiveness of the therapy. So it is not an opinion, it has been proven. And if I know the answer about how to improve The glycemic control for my patients, I would be a very rich and famous physician. I'm sure about that. I don't know if we have already. I don't know if we have that. So like I said, we have to face clinical inertia. We have to be more aggressive. We have to treat patients early. We have to use medication that patient has access to it. I think there are a lot of things to do, but not a single answer will. Not a single thing will answer this.
Okay, I think we've exceeded our time. Thank you very much for joining us.